Howdy Explorers, I'm Joe. Keeping on in our next video in the Ghost Stories series, we're going to be talking about somebody who absolutely did exist, but really probably shouldn't have. Today, we're going to talk about the legend of Patty Cannon, the Mistress of Misery. For this video, unlike the Big Liz video, I'm not going to take any liberties with the story or anything like that, but I will be including segments from later novels that add to the folklore of Patty Cannon, and we'll get into exactly what parts of that are where. The main source for the factual part of this video is the Maryland Archive, together with supporting sources from DorchesterHistory.com, as well as the book for the fictional parts of it, The Entailed Hat, or Patty Cannon's Times, by George Alfred Townsend. Originally published in 1884, I found pretty much an entire, uploaded PDF copy that I read through. The language is archaic, which, for 1884 that makes sense, but it was actually a pretty wild read if you ever have the chance. So on to our infamous villainess. Patty Cannon was born sometime around the 1750s. There isn't a ton of record about what she did before the early 1800s, what led her into infamy, but based on what we know of her, it's likely pretty much the same thing. Patty Cannon's claim to infamy is that she and her gang abducted and sold free blacks into slavery in the period just after the War of 1812 until her arrest and later death in the 1820s. What makes this such a grotesque story and why it's on the channel for this point in time is that what Patty Cannon did to these people, um, well, we'll fill in more detail in a little bit. Patty Cannon was always known for being a severe woman. She wasn't very friendly in town. She didn't stop and say hi to people. Not that I do that, that's a little strange, but hey, different time. She didn't really seem to be very warm or loving, even to her own family. Keeping in mind the time in which this takes place and in which she lived, she was known for being particularly cruel to her own slaves, and that sort of sets the tone for where the story goes. Her husband, Jesse Cannon, died in 1826, and the couple only had one daughter together. This daughter would go on to marry a man named Joseph Johnson, and this would start the core of the Cannon-Johnson gang, and takes us to that period right after the War of 1812 where a lot of the horrible things that the gang did starts. Beginning on a record, taking place somewhere around 1810, Cannon and her gang began abducting free blacks in the area of Reliance, Maryland. Now, I would never miss an opportunity to talk about the Eastern Shore, but in particular in this story, the geography of Reliance actually matters a lot. So, Reliance sits on the border of Dorchester County, Caroline County, Maryland, and Sussex County, Delaware. And that's pretty important to keep in mind, so just know that the area of operations for Patty Cannon is touching corners of three distinct areas, two counties in one state and one whole state on the other side of it. During this time that she operated in, this is before things like the Fugitive Slave Act was a big talking point later in the 1840s and 50s. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act actually had its kind of start right after the Revolution, even when talks of the Constitution were starting. So that was a thing for quite a while, not just in the period that we typically think of it today. And what the Fugitive Act was, this is using verbiage from the later one, but the idea was essentially the same, is that if a person sees a slave and captures them, it is their right to turn them into the authorities to be transported back to the plantation that they came from to continue their life of servitude. What often happened were there were people that would abduct either escaped slaves, free blacks, or a slave that they saw maybe out at the market getting something anyway. These people would abduct black people and then sell them to these slave traders for money. They would be sold down whether they were slave or not, and then the smuggler, slave trader would pay out these people quite a bit of money for abducting. Now, that's really how Patty Cannon and her gang, her daughter and their husband really made their money. That's how they stayed alive and bought so much property. And just that act of selling somebody who may or may not, really the act of selling anybody regardless, is absolutely reprehensible. And it's more than enough to make her a villain. But it wasn't enough for Cannon. She systematically tortured, abused, and often murdered those abductees. Of the remains later recovered from her farm, at least 2 of the sets of bones belonged to young children, and of the 2 adults, damage had been done to the skull via blunt force trauma. In addition to the physical evidence of the corpses of her victims, one member of Cannon's gang, Cyrus James, led investigators to the property and showed them the remains, as well as testified to the cruelty shown to the captives by Cannon. Interestingly, for the time at least, Cannon's gang was multiracial, typically consisting of enslaved or abducted blacks under threat of death to lure other free blacks into being abducted. It would seem that Cannon also had no problems murdering white people, as a slave trader from Georgia would also be found on the property, buried in a chest in a corner of a field, also with blunt force trauma to the skull. Cannon frequently used her geographic location to her advantage. After all, she owned property in each of the border regions she was on. If one area's law enforcement, say the Dorchester County Sheriffs, came looking after her, she simply operated in another property for a time. She would go to Sussex County to her Sussex County farm. She would go to Caroline County to that farm. This action the time that she operated in, predated federal law enforcement service, and often if somebody fled one jurisdiction, they could continue on until the heat died down more or less. Part of the reason why, at least on the Eastern Shore, Patty Cannon is so well known or so talked about is because of George Alfred Townsend's The Entailed Hat. So in that book, the house that Patty Cannon operated in is said to have had trapdoors, hidden chambers where Cannon would store the abductees. She would make them wait there while she got things ready to be sold, starving to death, in various states of torture until they were sold. Legend has it that from this house would moan the wails of the tortured and the dead in the wind, and the floorboards of the house would weep blood. I told you that book was a wild ride. Back to reality. After investigations and cooperation from law enforcement as far as Philadelphia, Patty Cannon was arrested and indicted formally for 4 murders. It is very likely that there are many more than 4 murders that she is responsible for. She died, cold, broken, and alone in her cell on May 11, 1829. In death, Patty Cannon left one more mystery. It is still debated today whether she committed suicide while waiting to be hanged, or if she simply died of old age as she was in her 60s to 70s at the time. However it turned out, the legacy of Patty Cannon is a very dark chapter in antebellum Maryland history. She's a cruel figure who caused pain and suffering to many people. Truly the stuff of nightmares, and an even scarier thought that this person actually existed and operated in our world. So, that was Patty Cannon. Let me know in the comments if you guys have ever heard of Patty Cannon or if you've been to around her house. One good vignette for me is that when I was in elementary school, not my teacher per se, but like the teacher's assistant, had a house that was on the plot of land of Patty Cannon's farm, and I'll put up a picture of the sign that used to be in front of the house without the address of the house. Anyway, it's a National Historical Registered marker, and she was even on one of those PBS shows about Maryland history, the Maryland PBS, and they did a whole investigation to see like if that was the house. It turns out it's not the house. And so in fact in the episode she says, "Oh, I'll have to tell them to change that." And a few years ago, maybe like, I'm getting old, 5 or 10 years ago, the sign did change to say like, "Hey, this is the plot of land Patty Cannon owned. The house is near where the first house would be." So that's an interesting connection that I have to it, and I know as I would go up from a place called Hurlock to Seaford with my family, I'd always kind of look to the left and see that house and get, I could freak myself out about exactly what went on there in my head. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought about this. Let Let me know if you guys like the series, if you like kind of looking at these fun stories and seeing if there's anything historically there. I appreciate any feedback. Lets me know you guys are moving around out there. All right, see you on the next one. I was Joe. Take care. Hey there, post-editing Joe. I don't know why I didn't include this like in the main video. I remember reading it and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But anyway, so uh, the jail that Patty Cannon was buried at, with developing and everything. Anyway, eventually they exhumed her body and her skull was dismembered from her the rest of her corpse, and that skull rested for the longest time at the Dover Public Library in Dover, Delaware. And you could sign it out and see it and things like that, and people often did. But just yeah, imagine that you're at the library looking for some books, and then hey, could I see this murderer skull? Wild. Anyway, for real this time, that's all I've got for you. Thanks for stopping by. See you on the next one.